I don't know if you were noticing in Psalm 2 when it was read, for me, it's kind of a fun psalm. There aren't a lot of places in the Bible where it talks about heaven laughing. But in Psalm 2, in fact, one of the translations doesn't use the word laugh. It says heaven was in derision. They were falling down laughing. They were laughing because the kings of the earth thought they were special, thought they had power. And it says, when the kings of the earth, the empires of the earth, the rulers of the earth think that somehow they have the power, heaven just laughs. On this Transfiguration Sunday, that caused me, that combination of Psalm 2 and the story of the Transfiguration and heaven laughing. You know, Jesus went up on the mountain with 3 of the disciples. And when Jesus goes up on the mountain, I can't help but remember when Jesus was taken onto a high mountain by Satan. And Satan offered him all the kingdoms of the earth. And heaven laughed. The earthly powers think they're that. And Jesus said, worship the Lord your God. Him only should you serve. Well, that's kind of background. For our text today, we're looking at Matthew 17, verses 1 to 9. And I don't know if it's a practice here at all, but today let's stand as we listen to Matthew 17. Would you stand with me for the gospel reading? After 6 days, Jesus took with him Peter, James, and John, the brother of James, and led them up on a high mountain by themselves. Led them up on a high mountain. What happens on mountains? You can sit down. You'll have to stand up again when I finish reading. But what are the biblical stories and texts about things that take place on mountains? So this is quiz time. You have to shout out. What happens on mountains in the Bible? God speaks to people specifically. What are the mountain stories? God could speak in the valleys too, you know. I've heard some powerful things from God when I was in the valleys too. What are the mountain stories of the Bible? The burning bush, okay? God met Moses in the burning bush. Was that on a mountain? I didn't even have that in my list. I'd have to go look if that was in a mountain. Moses and the 10 Commandments. Yeah, Moses is on this mountain. Moses went up on the mountain. A cloud came on this mountain. A cloud came on the mountain when Moses went up. And you got the 10 Commandments. We'll return to that in a little bit. Where did the ark land? Mount Ararat. What happened on Mount Moriah? It's quiz time. Abraham took Isaac to Mount Moriah, where he was told he was going to sacrifice Isaac. And then God provided the sacrifice. Mount Sinai, we've already covered that one. Mounts Ebal and Gerizim, familiar at all? They came into the promised land, and some of the people were to go on Mount Ebal, and some were to go on Mount Gerizim, and the blessings and the curses that would take place in the promised land, the blessings if they obeyed God, the curses if they didn't. That was Mount Ebal and Mount Gerizim. Mount Pisgah, you've heard of that probably. Anybody know what happened to Mount Pisgah? Moses went up on Mount Pisgah when he was told he could not enter the promised land. And from Mount Pisgah, he could see the promised land. So God showed him the promise, even though he wasn't going to be able to go there. Mount Carmel, Elijah, and God defeated the prophets of Baal. I think I have these on a screen there if I put them up. There we go. Mount Carmel, where Elijah defeated prophets of Baal. Is that the last one there? Then we go to a high mountain where Satan took Jesus to tempt him. There's the Sermon on the Mount. There's Mount Hermon. That's where today's story takes place. And we'll also find Elijah at one point on Mount Hermon. The Mount of Olives, where Jesus prayed before he was betrayed, and where he ascended from after the resurrection. And we talk about Calvary's mountain, which may not technically be a mountain, but where Jesus was crucified. And most of these stories have interactions with the text we're going to look at today, the Transfiguration text. You sit with it a while, you begin to realize, oh, there are so many intersections between these mountain events of the Bible and this one. So now it's time to stand again. Matthew 17. After 6 days, Jesus took with him Peter, James, and John, the brother of James, and led them up to a high mountain by themselves. And there he was transfigured before them, and his face shone like the sun, and his clothes became as white as the light. And just then there appeared before them Moses and Elijah, talking with Jesus. And Peter said to Jesus, "Lord, it's good for us to be here. If you wish, I will put up 3 shelters, one for you, and one for Moses, and one for Elijah." And while he was still speaking, a bright cloud covered them, and a voice from the cloud said, "This is my son whom I love. With him I am well pleased. Listen to him." And when the disciples heard this, they fell face down to the ground and terrified. But Jesus came and touched them. "Get up," he said. "Don't be afraid." And when they looked up, they saw no one except Jesus. And as they were coming down the mountain, Jesus instructed them, "Don't tell anyone what you have seen until the Son of Man has been raised from the dead." You may be seated. One addition to this story comes from the same account in the book of Luke. In the parallel account, Luke tells us what Moses and Elijah were talking to Jesus about. They were talking about his departure. His exodus is the word that is used in some translations. It would happen, they said, with bloodshed. And Moses knew something about the exodus with bloodshed. When the children of Israel exited Egypt, it was the blood of the lamb put on the doorposts that protected them from death. Now, if you've ever wondered what prompted Peter to think about building 3 shelters, 3 tabernacles, then you're in good company. It seems that every book I read this past week, every commentary I looked at, when it came to that section about Peter saying, "I'll build 3 shelters," every one of them tended to say, "We don't know what that was about." They said it in more fancy ways than that. But they're not sure what Peter was thinking when he wanted to put up 3 shelters. Caused me to wonder how often God looks at me and says, "What were you thinking?" Maybe you have an answer. The commentaries didn't have much of one. What we do know is that the idea of building a place of shelter on the mountain was interrupted by God. The text says, while Peter was still speaking, not when he was done, but while he was still speaking, a bright cloud covers them, and it doesn't just come above them, it covers them. It's like they were in the cloud, and a voice from the cloud speaks. Now, Moses and Elijah had similar experiences. Wonder what they thought when Peter talked about that. Both Moses and Elijah had met God on the mountain. The cloud of God's presence, as you already said, was part of Moses' experience more than once. And Elijah had met God on a mountain when God directed him to a cave. You may know that story. God took him to the mountain, Mount Hermon, I believe it was, and there was a great wind, and God was not in the wind. And there was an earthquake. God was not in the earthquake. And there was fire, and God was not in the fire. And it became completely silent. And at that point, Elijah walked out to the mouth of the cave. And we talk about the still, small voice of God that spoke to Elijah. So God's presence interrupts Peter. as Peter was trying to do something special by building a house or a shelter for Moses and Elijah and Jesus. And that may teach us something about making a house of worship more important than the person we worship. I think that's worth thinking about a little bit. Do we ever get caught wanting to make our shelters, our tabernacles, our houses of worship more important than the one we worship? The voice of God interrupts when Peter wants to make a place of worship, a tabernacle for these three. And the voice of God interrupts and says, "This is my beloved Son. With him I am well pleased. Listen to him." Listen to him. And when God speaks out of the cloud, James and John and Peter all fall face down on the ground. And then Jesus touches them, and he says, "Get up. Don't be afraid." And when they look again, everything's back to normal. It's just them and Jesus. Moses, Elijah, the cloud out of which God spoke, they're all gone. And then on the way back down from the mountain, Jesus says something that I'm sure was confusing. "Don't tell anyone what you saw. Not until the Son of Man has been raised from the dead." Don't be afraid. Last week I talked about fear too. We're so much more easily manipulated, caused to act on the basis of fear than we are on the basis of assurance. And so we need to hear many, many times God's word. Don't be afraid. Don't be driven by fear. Trust me, I'm here. I'm with you. So for the next few minutes, I'm going to consider Peter. Peter and his life from the vantage point of this event in Peter's life. Before we start this survey, though, I want to tell you I'm not picking on Peter. I don't think there's any need to make Peter look bad. But I'm doing it because we are so much like Peter. In the face of our fears and uncertainty, we quickly forget the highlights of our salvation. And we're prompted sometimes to act in ways that we wouldn't act if we were confident of Jesus' presence. And we find Peter doing that too, in a variety of places, a variety of times. I'm using Peter as a way of reminding us of the words of God on this Transfiguration Sunday. Listen to him. And then the very next thing that Jesus says after God says listen to him is what? Don't be afraid. Get up and don't be afraid. This transfiguration takes place right after Peter had made his great confession. You know the story, I expect. Jesus comes to the disciples and he says, "Who do people say that the Son of Man is?" And they say, "Well, some say Elijah. And some say John the Baptist come back to life. And some say the other prophets, which would have included Moses." And then Jesus says, "Well, who do you say that I am?" And Peter says, "You are the Christ. You're the Messiah. You're the Son of God." Now that took place before the Transfiguration. But right after Peter said, "You're the Son of God," Jesus said the same thing that Moses and Elijah would say a week later on the mountain. Jesus said, "And I am going to be persecuted. I am going to suffer greatly at the hands of the scribes and the priests and the elders and the chief priests, and I'm going to be killed." And Peter, who has just said, "You're the Christ, you're the one who knows God and who's bringing the ways of God to us," Peter's just said that's who you are, and Jesus says, "And I'm going to suffer and die," and Peter says, "No, you're not." Can you imagine he corrects the Messiah right after he claims that he's the Messiah? He tells Jesus that Jesus is wrong, that this suffering and dying shouldn't happen. He says, "God forbid it, Lord. It must never happen." And of course, Jesus says, "Get behind me, Satan." then just 6 days later, they're on the mountain with Moses and Elijah. And they experience this transfiguration and the voice of God that says, listen to him. And Jesus says, don't be afraid. Well, sometime less than a year later, Peter's forgotten about this mountaintop experience, apparently, when Moses and Elijah spoke about the coming death, because they're in the garden, and the soldiers of the high priest have come to arrest Jesus. And Peter takes it on himself to stop them. In fear, he pulls out his sword. He swings it wildly, I assume. Peter was not a swordsman. And he cuts off the high priest's ear. And Jesus again rebukes him. He says, put it away. That's not the way it'll be in my kingdom. And Jesus heals the high priest's ear. Peter seems to have forgotten the words on the mountain. Listen to him. And don't be afraid. Well, then comes the trial. And Peter is again fearful. He didn't seem to learn anything in the garden. But he's followed. He wants to know what happened. But when he's asked about Jesus, he says, I don't know him. Remember, this is Peter who said, you're the Messiah. He says, I don't know him. I don't know this man. Remember the words on the mountain? This is my son. Listen to him. And Jesus' words, don't be afraid. Mountaintop experiences can be like that. I don't know what mountaintop experiences may be part of your lives, but I've had them. We love them. We want to hold on to them. Perhaps we even want to build monuments to them. We try and repeat them. We try and find them again, but always we must come back down. And we forget them. There are two coming down experiences in Moses and Elijah's life. And because they were on the mountain, they might be worth looking at too. Moses, who was there on the Mount of Transfiguration talking with Jesus, had been on the mountaintop with God. He went up Mount Sinai. He spent 40 days there with God. While he was there, God gave him not just the 10 Commandments, but all the laws that should be followed. And he also showed him the heavenly tabernacle and gave him the design for building the earthly tabernacle. And he came down with the 10 Commandments written on stone. And when he got down, what did he find? That the people had made a golden calf and were worshiping it in immorality like the nations around did their worship. And Moses was so frustrated. Remember what I said about coming down from the mountain? And how earth can seem so difficult when you come down from that mountain. He was so frustrated, he smashed the 10 Commandments. You know, Moses was the first person that broke all 10 Commandments. Maybe you never thought of that before. Mountaintop experiences can be like that. And then there's Elijah. Elijah was up on a mountain, because that's always where you did sacrifices. Elijah has challenged the prophets of Baal to a contest. I'm sure you know this story too. They build an altar, and he says, call on your God, Baal, to send down fire to light the altar. And so they spend all day. And Elijah chides them and actually makes fun of them, as they can't seem to do it. Finally, toward the end of the day, Elijah has his altar. He has the sacrifice on it, and he covers it with water so that the troughs around it are full of water. And then he calls on God, and the fire comes down, and it burns everything. You know what happened after that? Well, a couple things. There'd been a famine in the land. 3 years, I think. And so Elijah then calls on God to end the famine, and God ends the famine. But King Ahab goes back to Queen Jezebel and tells her what Elijah's done, and that he's had all the prophets of Baal killed. And Jezebel says, I will kill him. Back down from the mountain. And Elijah is overcome with depression. he actually at that point calls on God to take his life. He says, it's not worth it. I do all this and look what happens to me. I've been very zealous for the Lord, the God of hosts. The Israelites have forsaken their covenant and thrown down their altars and killed your prophets with the sword, and I alone am left. And now they are seeking my life to take it away. Now God tells him, reassures him he isn't alone. There are 7,000 others who haven't bowed down to the idols. And that's when he sends Elijah. He feeds him. So he has the strength to go to the mountain where God reveals himself, as I said before, not in the fire and the earthquake and the wind, but in the silence. But he tells Elijah to go anoint kings of the enemies of Israel, who are going to carry out God's judgment against Israel. And Elijah goes out and does it, but he does it in fear. Mountaintop experiences can be like that. We always come back down. And so Jesus and Peter and James and John come back down from the mountain, and what do they find? They find the other disciples who have been confronted by a man who brought his son who was possessed by an evil spirit. And they're asking the other disciples to cast them out, cast the spirit out, and they can't. And Jesus says, you have little faith. And casts out the evil spirit. And they're back down in real life where evil is there confronting good. So Peter, one more time. It's after the resurrection, but Peter is back fishing. Remember, Jesus said, I'll make you a fisher for men. But after the crucifixion, Peter says to the rest of the disciples, let's just go fishing. And so they're out fishing for fish when they're supposed to be fishers of men. And Jesus appears on the shore. They don't know who it is yet. He says, throw your net on the other side of the boat. They'd had that experience before. And the net's full and breaking. And Peter comes to the shore, and the other disciples bring the fish, and Jesus feeds them. And then Jesus takes Peter for a walk. Peter has denied Jesus. Peter has pulled out the sword and used a method that Jesus wasn't okay with. And now he's back fishing for fish instead of fishing for men. And Jesus takes him for a walk. He says, do you love me? 3 times. And then he says, feed my lambs, feed my sheep. I think again Peter remembers, listen to it. Don't be afraid. Peter finally seems to get it, because it's after this, when the Holy Spirit came at Pentecost and Peter preached that marvelous Pentecost sermon, and 3 to 5,000, I guess 3,000 that day were saved. And then he and John go and they heal the lame man at the temple. And the Jewish leaders say, don't speak in Jesus' name. And Peter says, well, what can we do? He's the resurrected one. Peter's no longer filled with fear. He listens and speaks for Jesus in ways that he couldn't before. And so then finally, Peter's an old man. I think he's beginning to realize that he may not live to see the return of Jesus. And so as an older man, he's writing letters back to the scattered followers of Jesus, the exiles, he calls them at the beginning of 1 Peter. And we've already heard it read this morning, but we need to come back to it. Peter says, we did not follow cleverly devised stories when we told you about the coming of our Lord Jesus, Christ in power. But we were eyewitnesses of his majesty. We didn't make this up. We were there. And when he says that, I know I've read it before, and there's a part of me that says, I think they expected him then to talk about the resurrected Jesus who came back in power. But instead, he takes them to the Mount of Transfiguration. And he says, he, Jesus, received honor and glory from God the Father when the voice came to him from the majestic glory saying, this is my Son whom I love. With him I am well pleased. We ourselves heard this voice that came from heaven when we were with him on that sacred mountain. So the old man Peter is writing back to the people and saying, stay firm. Listen to him. Don't be afraid. I heard the voice on the mountain. And he goes on, we also have the prophetic message, something completely reliable. And you will do well to pay attention, to listen to it, as to a light shining in a dark place until the day dawns and the morning star rises in your hearts. Listen to him. The voice from the cloud said, listen to him. And Jesus said, don't be afraid. So to close this morning, as we remember God's words, listen to him, and Jesus' words, don't be afraid, I would remind us once more of that encounter that Peter had with Jesus on the shore when Jesus asked 3 times, do you love me? And let you know that Peter got the message, and pray that we get it too, even if he was a slow learner like many of us. So he writes to the believers and to us, and in 1 Peter 8:9, he says, although you have not seen him, you love him. Even though you do not see him now, you believe in him and rejoice with an indescribable and glorious joy. And so he says, you love him. And then 6 times in the 2 books, 1st and 2nd Peter, he says that they should love each other. Those are the words of Jesus. Jesus talks about love very specifically 3 times. He says, love your enemies from the mountain, the Sermon on the Mount. He says, love God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. He said, those are the 2 greatest commandments. And then 3 times in the book of John, Jesus says to the disciples, love one another. Seems that Peter got it. I trust that we are getting it too. So as Peter was finishing his first letter, he wrote, through Silvanus, whom I consider a faithful brother, I have written this short letter to encourage you and to testify that this is the true grace of God. Stand fast in it. It's almost as if he says again, listen to him and don't be afraid. Listen to him and don't be afraid.